Greetings all, F-Man here. Welcome to another 1/200 scale die-cast model aircraft review of this from Gemini Jets, the Boeing 737-600, here in Janet colors. Deja vu? Perhaps a little bit. Those of you who have seen my other model aircraft reviews may well have seen my October 2023 review of this very aircraft, Boeing 737-600 in Janet colors, tail number November 273 Romeo Hotel. However, that one was in 1/400 scale, and Gemini Jets since decided to put into production this, the very same aircraft, but 100% bigger, 1/200 scale this one is. Therefore, this is a 1/200 scale review, and just a word of caution to those of you who might be more interested in the particulars of the real-world aircraft, this review is more or less dedicated to a survey of this model as we see it, because we covered a lot of those specifics in terms of the aircraft's real-world characteristics, its history, its flight characteristics, and its service history in the 1/400 review that I did back in October of 2023. There's a link to that one popping up someplace here on the corner of the screen right now, as well as in the description of this video. So if you would like some of that real-world information, I do suggest that you take a look at that review before taking a look here at this one. However, because this is a 1/200 scale model, and, well, it's breaking my general rule of avoiding 1/200 scale, or really any scale larger than 1/400, simply on account of I've got to store the things, and 1/200s obviously are bigger than 1/400s for the most part, because this is a Boeing 736, because it is the smallest of the next generation, the NG series of 737, and because, therefore, there are actually some 1/400 scale models that are larger than this model in 1/200 scale, it's not much of a penalty for me to have acquired this one. And, of course, when I've got the opportunity to acquire a model of the same aircraft in two different scales, I've got to say that, yes, that's a very nice opportunity to have, not one that you get all that often, and it really does enable you to appreciate the aircraft itself as the monolith that it is, the archetype that it is, in different ways, because you're able to interface with those models in different ways. You get the form factor and portability of a 1/400, but the 1/200 offers you a little bit greater fidelity in available details. So they've all got their pros and cons. Because of the size of this one, really, I decided, you know what, let's take the opportunity and get this one. We'll have another example of two models in two scales of the same aircraft, so very cool. However, because of that, I've got to say it's one of my favorites. It's one of the more interesting ones as well because, well, we've got Janet colors here. Janet, it's an airline or not. It exists or not. It goes to places that exist or not. Makes it very interesting subject matter. However, be all of that as it may, I do now bid all of you to make sure that your seatbacks and tray tables are in their upright and locked positions and that your seatbelts are securely fastened because we are ready for takeoff. Let's go. Before we take a closer look at this 1/200 scale diecast model by Gemini Jets, we of course have to take a look at the box from whence it comes. Coming in here at obnoxiously close range from screen right, here we go. Yes, here is that Gemini Jets 200 scale box. Yeah, we've got ourselves quite the stuff. We're gonna try and see what we can do with this. However, we have got in our upper left-hand corner Gemini 200, as you might well expect. However, it is a bit different from other Gemini 200 boxes that you might have seen in the past as we get this thing a little bit better positioned. There we go. Gemini 200 up in the upper left, that's not at all untoward. However, take a look at the front panel of this box. What do you not see? Well, if you remember my review of the 1/400 scale version of this aircraft, this box is very reminiscent thereof. There is no rendering of the aircraft here front and center on the front panel. Instead, it is replaced with an actual photograph showing, among other things, the Las Vegas Strip, the Luxor Hotel. That's that pyramid structure there, replete with an Egyptian-looking, I hope it's looking and not actually an artifact, obelisk. However, in the foreground, you can see that we have got the flight line of an airport featuring what? Well, we have got ourselves a whole bunch of Janet 737-600s right there. One of which is probably the tail number that we're looking at here in 1/200 scale, and the same tail number that we saw in 1/400 scale, consequently. But different from a lot of Gemini Jets boxes in that there's no rendering of the aircraft in particular, although it might be one of those that's pictured there on the Janet flight line at Harry Reid McCarran International Airport there in Las Vegas. Other details here on the front panel of the box, we've got Janet title graphics, as it were. There obviously are no titles on a Janet fuselage, but we've got Janet right there. 1/200 scale die-cast model aircraft down below in the lower left. On the lower right, we've got Boeing 737-600 trademark, and the item number, for those of you keeping score, is G2EGG1200. That's about that for the front cover of the box. If we move the box to the right side panel, there we go. A little bit more conventional here. Gemini 200. We have got 1/200 scale die-cast model, item number reiterated, and then there's a rendering of the aircraft, Boeing 737-600. Top panel of the box, similar there. Adult collectible model, warning, contains small parts, unsuitable for children under 14 years of age, item number and barcode there. Gemini 200 on the left side. Left panel of the box, basically the same as the right panel, Gemini 200, 1/200 scale die-cast model, and then rendering of the aircraft again with the type. Bottom panel, blank, but for Gemini 200, and then the top panel of the box, we saw that already. What else is going on inside this box, though? Well, unlike most of the 1/400 models, we don't have a look inside tab. However, we do have a tab that we can open up and look inside because, well, got to put the model someplace. If we pull forward on this magnetically secured panel, there you go, closes with a nice little click, and then we flip it up, you can see that we've got ourselves the well in which the airplane sits. And we can open that, there we go. Obviously the airplane sits inside this little sarcophagus, it's that open cell foam stuff. Inside here we have got some plastic film just for handling the airplane. Obviously the airplane sits in there. And then we have got a little bag which contains some blanking panels for the landing gear. We'll talk about that. They don't entirely do what you would expect them to do, which I've got to say is a first for me in this 1/200 market from Gemini Jets. Another thing, though, that you'll see in the box is you will see this panel, which will sit on top of everything that we just looked at, more open cell foam. However, you'll see here, we have got these 4 metallic elements. 3 of them are stored vertically, and then there's one behind that horizontally. That's a stand. Gemini do often, in fact, I would say pretty much always, they include a stand with their 1/200 scale models. However, this one's a little bit different. It's a much smaller stand, and it's actually something that I would say is more appropriate for a 1/400. The size of this model, obviously, is very small in 1/200 scale because it's a very small aircraft as far as airliners go. But this stand, we'll get back to that. However, that's about what you see when you take a look at the box, and that's about what you see when you take the airplane out of the box and you get it out here on display, as you can see right here, looking absolutely wonderful. So then, what is it that we're looking at here, this 1/200 scale Gemini Jets 737-600 liveried for Janet? Well, those of you who have not seen my review from October 2023 of the 1/400 scale version of this exact aircraft, November 273 Romeo Hotel, I do urge you to take a look at that one because in there we talk a little bit more about the specifications in terms of technicalities on the 737-600. It is a member of the NG, Next Generation series of 737, which is the penultimate to-date iteration of the 737 in its long and venerable career. However, it's the smallest iteration of the Next Generation 737. It also had a few interesting features in terms of things that it lacked and never received in terms of refits and later updates as the series was continued. They only built about 60 of these. The specific number is in the 1/400 review. The last one I remember was built in 2006 and it was delivered to WestJet up in Canada. However, this is really a very small 737 NG, and therefore it's not really the best suited to the demands of modern airlines, be they passenger or cargo. They have the lowest seating capacity of any NG 737. They have the shortest range of any NG 737, and, well, because of that, their applications are rather limited. If you happen to be either the US government or a puppet organization that's masquerading on behalf of the US government as totally not the US government, and you call yourself Janet and you paint your airplanes white and red, then it's the perfect aircraft for you, because you can effectively use it like a flying bus in that, well, maybe you can fit 90 to 110 people on board depending on what your seating configuration is like. However, you can cram them in all you want because you're only going to be airborne for maybe an hour tops, and that's assuming that perhaps you're going over to the Dryden Flight Research Center, Edwards Air Force Base. If you're going to be going to Homey, as in Kilo X-Ray Tango Alpha, as in Area 51 from McCarran Harry Reid, you're only going to be in the air for maybe 30-35 minutes, and that's assuming that you just don't directly fly straight in from your route from Las Vegas. Which means that, yeah, you don't really care about your passenger comforts. Because your passengers are all government employees, and they're all very privileged government employees because they've all got, at very least, top secret clearance, probably whatever higher classification ratings are above that, they've probably got all of that, because if you're going to be going to the storied Area 51, you're going to be dealing with some very interesting things, and therefore, yeah, they definitely have vetted you, and you're going to be disciplined enough to deal with no legroom for your 30-minute flight, and no in-flight meal service either, I would reckon. However, what is it? Why have we decided to get this model in 1/200 scale? I always say, now in the third time that I've done a review of a 1/200 scale aircraft model, that I don't want to accrue too many of these because they're bigger than the 1/400s, obviously, but because of that, they're harder to store. Well, this one I had to make some exceptions for because, well, number one, it's Janet, and Janet, despite us not knowing all that much about them, at least not in definitive terms, it's very interesting to have a model of an airplane that services an organization that no one knows about and serves a purpose that we know very slightly more about, but in terms of what it's actually doing and who is on board, we know basically nothing. So that's very interesting in and of itself, and it is always interesting to have the same aircraft, as in the same airframe, in two different scales, if at all possible. We've got this one in 1/400, and now we've got this one in 1/200. On top of all of that, although this is a 1/200 scale, although this is literally twice the size as the 1/400, this 1/200 scale model of a 737-600, because the 737-600 is the aircraft that it is in reality, it's actually, in 1/200 scale, basically exactly the same size as a 1/400 scale 747. And I've got quite a number of those, so really are we losing all that much in terms of storage space if we get this versus another 1/400 scale 747? No, we're really not. Therefore, I decided to take the plunge, and I'm quite glad that I did, because despite this being a very small 1/200 scale model, it does, being a 1/200, have many of the features that you've come to expect from some of the larger 1/200s from the Gemini Jets line. And therefore, it is a very nice change of pace. The 1/400 model that we looked at, obviously this is a pretty small airliner in reality, therefore the 1/400 scale version is going to be a very small model to respect the constraints of the scale, of course. So to have it a little bit bigger, to be able to see some of the details that are on the 1/400, but they're just really small, so to be able to magnify that and to be able to appreciate that a little bit more, it definitely is a very nice thing. But also, for this being the 1/200 scale model that it is, it's very cool to appreciate the differences in construction and craftsmanship on this one. We talked about the 1/400 version having a plastic empennage. The horizontal and vertical stabilizers, both done in plastic, and it was somewhat noticeable. It wasn't really noticeable by eye, but it was noticeable by touch. This, 100% die cast through and through. The only bits of plastic on here are the engines and the engine nacelles, but everything else on the fuselage and the wings and the empennage, all done in die cast. So that is very nice. It is a very weighty model despite its diminutive size, and it certainly has a very nice presence. Also absent on this one that we did unfortunately see on the 1/400 version, some of those assembly faults in terms of wings being not mounted crookedly, but being actually a little bit bent and warped toward the wingtips. That's not evident on this one. As you can see, everything is looking straight, level, and true, and that is very good, very much appreciated. Also, even though it is exactly the same airplane, the livery, very simple as it is, but because it's a little bit bigger, things are a little sharper, things are a little bit more proportionate in terms of their respect to the rest of the size of everything, and it looks really nice therefore. Also, some of the ancillary details that we'll take a closer look at in the next few cuts. Details like separately applied antennas. We've got a few of them top side and on the ventral side of the fuselage. They look really nice. You can also see more engine detail here that we'll take a look at. So really there is a lot to be gained when you're taking a look at an aircraft of the size of the 737-600 in 1/400 versus 1/200 scale. The 1/400 it's well enough, but when you get an airplane like that in the larger size, now you can really start to appreciate what's actually going on here in a way that you simply can't with the 1/400 simply because of those size constraints. Stopping our rotation now and taking a look at this quarter view from the front port side, and what do we see? Well, we see what looks to be a very cogent and competently produced 1/200 scale 737-600, which is exactly what we would expect to see, is it not? Well, refraining from stating the obvious, we've got ourselves an object that looks like it has been finished very nicely, because it has been finished very nicely. Everything in terms of overall fit and finish looks good. As we remarked earlier, everything looks proportional, everything looks straight and level. There are no weird kinks in the wing structure, nothing is loose, nothing is crooked, everything just looks like it is, well, a scaled down version of the real thing, which is exactly what you would want to be seeing if you had just spent the better part of $130 for a model like this. Therefore, I'm very pleased to report all of that to you. Beyond all of that, what else do we have to see here? Well, as we have come to expect from Gemini Jets, both in 1/400 and 1/200 scale, everything is tampo printed, and all of those details that you can see here in terms of the livery, as well as accents like windows, both the cockpit windows and the cabin windows, your doors, door handles, things like that, all done with tampo printing over multiple passes to do each color, and everything looks good. Nothing is smeared, nothing is smudged, nothing is crooked, at least not according to what I can see by eye. And generally, everything looks good. You can see here really the only feature of the livery on this Janet 737 is that window line across the midsection encompassing all the cabin windows. Looks very nice. We have got that trapezoidal intake element there, not an intake element, but where the wings, well, not the wing, where the stripe starts there along the fuselage. You can see it joins up with the cockpit windows there in that trapezoidal shape, looks very good, and then of course it opens up into that rectangular band across the majority of the fuselage before terminating in that trapezoidal shape in a different direction at the tail cone. Looks really cool. Other things that we can see here, we have got a shut line that is showing the radome intersection with the fuselage proper. Obviously that would be a removable component for servicing the radar array underneath that fairing. We've also got a pitot tube right there just after the radome shut line. That looks good. Additionally, you can see our L1 door right there. There is an armature there. There is hardware detail for the handle to open and close the door. That's all printed on. And below that, you can see this rectangular panel below the L1 door. That will open up for the included internal air stairs on the 737-600. So if you don't have a jetway to pull up to, or if you don't have external stairs to roll up to the airplane on the ground, well, the 737-600 can take care of that all by itself, so that's really cool. Additionally, here across the leading edge of the wing, you can see very nice geometry there. Very cool throughout. Our pylon there mounting to the port engine nacelle looks good. The anti-ice ring on the intake side of the engine looks very good. And just a little bit of the engine core right there in terms of the cone there. That looks very nice. Wingtip here, we have got our red strobe here for the port side wing. We never had any winglets, be they scimitars, sharklets, whatever you want to call them. They never existed on the 737-600. The wings were simply too short. The wingspan on this aircraft is just about the same as its overall length, so that's interesting. And apparently the aerodynamicists at Boeing decided that no, there's no need for a winglet on an airplane that has that particular geometry. Very cool nonetheless, though. Other things you can see macrocosmically, we have got that very large vertical stabilizer. As we remarked in the 1400 review, that is the largest vertical stabilizer in proportion to the rest of the fuselage through the next generation lineup, through that NG series in the late 90s from Boeing. That's because this is the shortest of the 737 NGs, therefore you need the larger vertical stabilizer to impart a larger moment to have proper rudder authority. Really cool. Other elements of the empennage, such as the horizontal stabilizers, they look good there, and you can see how they are just raked slightly upward as they should be. Other details here, we have got external antennas across the top side of the fuselage, as you would expect, and of course they can be rendered a little bit more faithfully here in 1/200 scale in comparison to 1/400, and we've even got a little printed antenna up top here, in addition to our little faux ruby strobe light there for that marker beacon light along the top of the fuselage, something that's just painted on the 1/400. So again, the larger form factor is giving us the opportunity to have more separately applied details, which of course look really, really good. Looking at 737-600 here from nose on, this is where we really can discern this one from the 1/400. If you remember from the 1/400, we were remarking about that nose landing gear being a bit crooked, wherein we only had one wheel actually on the ground. Not the case with this one. As you can see, we have got both of those nose tires on the ground, straight and level, as it well should be. So that looks really good. Additionally, you can see the main gear as well, including the little fairings here on either side of the struts, supporting the axles there and supporting the weight of the aircraft above. However, those are just little fairings to cover up the struts when they're retracted. There are no main landing gear doors on the 737 NG because, well, it's just a little bit too close to the ground. Therefore, when the landing gear retract and they retract inboard along centerline, you just see the wheel hubs and, of course, the tires around them in the belly of the airplane, which is pretty cool. Not too many other airliners still do things like that. However, another artifact of this airplane being a bit close to the ground, the engine nacelles. You can see the lower sides of those nacelles, they are not circular, they are a bit flat. We saw this as well, obviously, on the 1/400, but they're flattened out because if you had a perfectly circular inlet there on the engine nacelle, there is a chance, particularly under compression loads on the main gear, as, say, the airplane was touching down, or in certain circumstances when you're taking off near maximum weight, you might actually grind those engine nacelles along the tarmac. So give yourself a little bit more safety margin there, and you can quite clearly see that we have got flattened out bottoms of those nacelles, as you might well expect. Pretty cool. Additionally, here you can see that everything is well straight and level here in terms of where our wingtips are in relation to the center line on the fuselage, as well as our empennage there. Sitting straight and level and true. Looks very, very good, I must say. Other details that are here evident, that cockpit, the cockpit windows there, they look very good. They look symmetrical. Other details that you can glean from that, we have got ourselves some windscreen wipers right there, just underneath the cockpit windows, as you might expect, in their stowed position. Additionally, we have got ourselves these eyebrow windows above, something somewhat unique on the 737s. Of course, there have been other airplanes that have features like that. The MD-80, probably a very famous example thereof, but the 737 NGs also have those eyebrow windows, and they're pretty cool. Other things you can see, landing gear doors proper on the nose gear. They're visible there. Very good. Of course, that is a removable section that we'll take a look at later on, but looks good nonetheless. Also, along the radome there, right at the nose of the airplane, you can see that that's not quite a straight conical profile either. There is some taper along the sides of the airplane, as you would expect, but underneath there's a little bit more of an undercut versus the top, which is more flat. So that's really cool. Those geometries have been very nicely replicated here by Gemini. So Very good. Somebody took some very nice measurements of the archetypical real-world aircraft and they translated that into 200 scale accordingly. So all of that is really nice. Nothing to complain about thus far on this one. Looks good. Taking a look here at the starboard side of the aircraft, just as we could see from that front quarter view, we can see that wonderful red window line here, the only major feature on this otherwise featureless Janet livery, all white of course. However, you can see here on the starboard side, just as we had seen partially on the port side anyway, you can see that it has been rendered faithfully and rather crisply. There's no overspray, there's no overpaint, no smudging or smearing that I can see either in that red paint itself or anywhere along the cabin windows, be they the cockpit windows, those little eyebrow windows, or of course the passenger cabin windows. We can see though, speaking of the passenger cabin windows, just as we saw on the 1400 aircraft, you can see that we have got that gap right in there between the forward and aft section of cabin windows, which strongly indicates that at very least we have a floor plan here, a seating configuration that would have a first class area. However, I seriously doubt that Janet care about any sort of class distinctions among their passengers, considering that they're all government employees or at very least government contractors who would be flying these very secret routes. Anyway, the engine detail here, we can see that wonderful starboard engine nacelle right through there. You can see that we have got a red line there, which is indicating where the static ports are for ground service equipment, things like a manual bleed air valve, things like that. So you could start the engine on the ground, as well as the main landing gear. We can see the landing gear, both the main and the nose gear here, but I do like the way that the main landing gear is visible there just underneath the wing root. You can see the little pseudo doors. I keep wanting to call them landing gear doors, but they're not doors proper here on the 737 as we discussed, but you just have these fairings around the struts that actually take up the weight of the airplane on the ground, just to shield them a little bit from wind blast when the gear are in the retracted position. The nose gear, of course, looks just as well here from side on view. It looks very, very nice. Additionally, you can see wing detail here. We have got ourselves our wingtip. Of course, we never had the scimitar winglets here on the 600s, but wingtip nonetheless. We've got the green strobe here being the starboard side of the aircraft. Also very nice leading edge detail on these wings. You can see the shut lines where the slats would be, in addition to the little canoe fairings underneath the flap actuation armature, and of course the trailing edge flaps here shown in their retracted position, as they are on the vast majority of model aircraft in 1/200 or 1/400 scale. Additionally, here on this view you can see that we have got two separately applied antennas across the dorsal side of the fuselage right through there, in addition to our separately applied strobe light, as we remarked in one of the previous cuts. Additionally, here you can see that we have got R1 and R2 doors fore and aft. We also have our door plug emergency overwing exit there, and we also do have the decals over the wing spar there that we'll be able to see later on when we take a view of this airplane from above. Moving toward the forward section, lower area of the fuselage, you can see a cargo door right through there. That's entirely correct. That's exactly where we should be. And in addition to that, we also have an aft cargo door there, just aft of where the tail cone starts to be formed as the lower side of the fuselage starts to cut upward. Speaking of the tail cone, there is the tail cone detail. Looks very, very nice. You can see the peculiar geometry of the 737 tail cone as it is cut at, I'm not quite sure what I would call that angle. It's definitely a bit of an acute angle though, cut upward in the tail cone, incorporating the exhaust for the auxiliary power unit. That all looks cool. Additionally, you can see horizontal stabilizer detail with our silvered wingtips there on the horizontal stab, and then of course we have got our very large vertical stab. Shunt lines are indicated there for the rudder, and you could also see two hinge points for the rudder in that vertical stabilizer, but of course no livery features whatsoever in that portion of the airplane. You can also see that there is a rendering of the de-ice boot done in silver along the leading edge of the vertical stabilizer. So definitely lots of really cool detail evident here. Also, you can see the fleet number visible here on the nose. We'll probably see this much closer later on, but right there, 204 fleet number there, just along the starboard side of the nose, below the cockpit windows here on November 273 at Romeo Hotel. Very cool. Taking a look now from the aft view, and here we can see some more details and also a couple of things that you might notice here if you've got particularly sharp eyes, but I can't say that that's a detractor from the model. The thing I'm thinking about is the main landing gear. If they don't look like they are perfectly straight in terms of being perfectly vertical, that's me, because of course this is a 1-200 and the vast majority of 1-200s from Gemini have removable landing gear. This is one of them, and we'll talk about this later on, but that's me. That's me putting the gear in the best that I can, and if they're not perfectly straight, they're not perfectly straight. That's on me. That's not a fault of the model. However, other details that we can see here from the aft view, we can now see in proper detail the auxiliary power unit exhaust right through there, very nice, and you can also see that we have got a beacon strobe light. This would be a white light just above the APU exhaust. That looks really cool, very authentically rendered. Below the tail cone, might not quite be able to see it from this angle, but we do have two hatches in the tail cone itself. That is the service access for the auxiliary power unit, that gas turbine jet engine in its own right, the secret third engine on a lot of airplanes. That's where you would get in there to do maintenance or to remove and replace the auxiliary power unit if that's necessary. However, trailing edge of the empennage here in terms of horizontal and vertical stabilizers look very, very nice. Everything looks straight and level, no fault whatsoever, although pretty thin, so not much to see from this particular angle. Trailing edges of the main wings, a little bit more to see. Shut line detail for the flaps. You might also just be able to see two more things along either side of the fuselage. We have got the overwing exit detail. That all looks pretty cool. Additionally, you might be able to see shut lines for the trailing edge flaps as well as the overwing spoilers that are going to deploy for roll control as well as for your speed brakes, both in the air and on touchdown on the ground. Spoilers come up and the thrust reverse will be enabled. Very cool. You can also see the trailing edges of the canoes, the flap armature fairings. Again, those are just aerodynamic components trying to smooth out the airflow and remove turbulence around what would otherwise be very unaerodynamic armature configuration for actuating those trailing edge flaps. So, doing their best to clean up the airflow there, reduce drag, and of course, increase efficiency. Speaking of efficiency, we can see here through our engines, port and starboard engines here visible. Just as we could see from nose on, we can see that we have got ourselves pass-through engines. Here done very, very nicely in 1-200. Again, because this is a 737-600, and even though it is in 1-200 scale, it is still a pretty small model, which means, yeah, some of these details are still very small. However, the fact that we have visible bypass through these engines is really, really good, and it's a feature that I definitely very much appreciate. So good job, Gemini, on rendering those engines. And I've got to say, they definitely look the part. Both the main fan there and the bypass through the nacelle, as well as the core, the hot part of the engine, looks very, very nice from this view. Definitely hope that's coming through reasonably enough for you on camera. But yeah, from the aft view, perhaps on the face of it, not as much to see, but there actually is quite a bit when you look a little bit more closely. Now from the port side of 736, what do we see here? A little bit less than we saw on the starboard side because we don't have our cargo loading doors here for the lower cargo deck. However, we do have a couple of things here that you don't see on the starboard side. First of all, we've got ourselves a red strobe here on our wing tip. That looks entirely correct. And additionally, you can see that we have got the little square underneath our L1 door. That's for the self-contained air stairs that the 736 has. Really cool feature. I wish more airplanes would have things like that, because it just adds to the overall utility of an aircraft in terms of the places it can go and the amount of ground support infrastructure it either does or does not need. So 736 obviously designed to be a little bit more rugged than some other airliners, and I appreciate that little feature. Really cool stuff. However, you can also see just below and aft of that little cutout there for the air stairs, you can see that we've got that red line. That is telling ground crews, thou shalt not pass when the engines are running, because yes, you run the risk of being ingested into the engines, and that's definitely not going to be a very good day. Other things that we can see here from this view, we have got our fleet number 204 reiterated here just below and aft of the main cockpit windows. Looks good. Additionally to that, we've also got static port details right through there. Very nice look at our port engine nacelle once again, as well as the hot core of the engine. Looks good. And of course we have got our main gear visible there. Additionally, we can see that we have two ventral antennas right down through here. They are not in line with each other longitudinally. They look like that here from this view, but the one that is nearer the camera is displaced latitudinally toward the port side of the aircraft, and the one that appears to be lower down, that's actually on center line ever so slightly aft of the one that appears to be higher and but is actually closer to the camera that you can't quite see from this view. Beyond that, looks like we have got a little bit of a naked duct happening just below the L2 door and just barely forward of our registration tail number there. So definitely some cool stuff to see here on this little model. Despite its diminutive size, there's quite a lot to be had visually, and we'll get into some of its more hands-on features next. Now for a survey of some of the 1-200 specific features that we've got here on this Janet 736. This one, as with most 1-200s by Gemini Jets, does feature removable landing gear. So to demonstrate that, the giant hand comes into frame and we lift the airplane. And, well, first of all, you can kind of see what the belly of the airplane looks like, but the landing gear, they are going to just sit in here under, well, tension in terms of the main gear, and there is a little magnetic closure on the nose gear. You just reach in and you pull, and then nose gear comes off, and then the main gear, they're a little bit trickier, but you pull, and then they come out, as you can see. A little bit harder, but you can see they come out here. Now you can see the empty wells where the landing gear would go, and for the moment we can sit the airplane down. Its weight is going to be borne pretty much exclusively on the engine nacelles. So it's not particularly heavy, so I wouldn't worry about this one nearly as much as, say, the 747 that we took at last time, that we took a look at a 1-200. But here we go, just the nose gear here. This is done in metal, and then the gear itself is plastic, and then the main gear. These are a little bit finicky, and you'll see why when we go to install the blanking panels on the landing gear. But here you can see we have got rubber tires around plastic wheels, so that looks pretty good. But you can see this odd shape to the main gear, which of course is necessitated by the way that they look on the prototype airplane. But yeah, you're going to see why this makes a little bit of a tricky situation when you want to display the airplane in an in-flight configuration. So at this point what you do is you go back into your box and you fish out the little plastic bag that would either have the landing gear components in it, as it does right now because we just removed the landing gear, or that has the blanking panels in it, which are right here. We've traded their position in the bag with the landing gear that we've removed. However, the blanking panels are thus. We have got the nose gear doors, which is just a single piece that's been folded up. That's in metal, so that's pretty cool. However, these next two pieces are the main gear, and because the main gear, the way it retracts on the 736, is a bit different in that there are no doors per se, the main gear blanking panels actually have half of a tire on them. If you can see that in focus here, more or less, you can see what they look like. You've got half of a tire on their underside, and then the other side is a blanking panel there that integrates the partial door that covers up where the strut would be when the gear is retracted. These are directionally specific, so this is the left side one, and then here is the right side one. They look identical to us, but on the back side that faces inside the belly of the aircraft, they are marked with an R and an L, so you're not going to confuse them that way. So that's pretty cool. Pretty self-explanatory there. However, when we install them, you're gonna see how this works. If we flip the airplane over, you'll see that we have our magnetic clasp that is mounted here inside the airplane, as you would expect, for our nose gear retention. However, our blanking panel does not have a little magnet in there, which means that there's nothing to retain this apart from its own tension. So when you stick that in there, it's a little bit tricky. There may be the slightest bit of magnetic attraction because this is metal, but it's not very strong. As you can see, I've got it in the well, but it's rattling around quite a bit. flip it over, and it does retain, but again, don't shake it too hard because it won't take much persuasion for that to come flying out of there, I greatly suspect. However, if we raise our position a little bit here with the camera, we can now get into the area of the main gear. And again, the main gear are location specific. So we're going to start with the left one, and this is the left one here that I've picked up. Remember, the wheel and tire are going to be facing down when they're in position. So this will go into its position here. And it's pretty finicky to get it in. It's more or less in. It's not quite in correctly. But okay, we've got that. So that's in. And now the right one can go in. Oh, no, that's not quite right. It's got to sit flush. Much easier said than done, but you can get it in position, and now you have to sort of mess around with pushing on it, and it's not quite sitting correctly. But as you mess around with pushing on these, you will find a spot where they don't necessarily look correct, but they stay in position, as you can see. And then we can place the airplane back down on our turntable and then lower the camera again so you can see it. So there we go. Those are our blanking panels installed, and they are staying in place. But now we get into the vexing matter of the stand that comes with this model. Let me show you what I mean. Returning to the packaging that comes with the model here, this is the upper packaging that covers the airplane when it's in the box. You can see here, as we showed you before, we have got our stand elements inside the packaging. So if we remove them from our open cell foam and we set them aside, you can see what we're dealing with. So we have got a stand in 4 pieces, and as we zoom back in, we'll be able to take a look at what they are and how we assemble these. This is clearly the top element of the stand, and then we have 3 support legs, and they have little rubber feet on them so you know which side is down. Seems easy enough. We have got 3 holes here, and that means that we just push our support legs as best we can into the holes right here. It's difficult to do this without obscuring the camera's view, but you know, function comes before form in this case. And you can see one of the problems already. These little feet are not secured very well, so they will come off, so you've got to put them back on, and then just as we did with the other 2, this one will attempt to push in as best as it can, but you can see already that we've got a problem, and then the pressure of me trying to squeeze that in with my hand then gets the foot all dislodged. So already you can see we have a problem with this. However, when you've assembled the stand, as it were, it's going to sit more or less like that. Okay, that's fine. And of course, on the bottom of the airplane we have a hole, which you can see right here. This is the hole. It's got a little rubber grommet in it so that it will sit more or less flush in there, and it'll be somewhat secure when you finally stick it into position. However, when we try to put it into position, here's what happens. Get this in, and I'm just going to line it up so we don't scratch that paint, because that would be tragic. We'll get it in here, and we'll get that on, and then we'll position the stand so no, it's not going to work that way. How about this way? Is that no, this way? Will it won't support it that way? No, it won't. How about this way? No, here. No, not like that either. It's secure in there. It's not coming off. But I can't yet find a position where the airplane will actually be supported by the stand, and the stand itself is kind of coming apart. Let's try that again. Let's give it the benefit of the doubt here. Let's make sure that these legs are really in a good spot. They're securely in there. I will even flip this top element around and really make sure that that's secure. Okay, maybe we're getting somewhere. Make this as vertical as we can. And then we'll make sure that we get this into the belly of the airplane as best as we can. Like so. Alright, so that's pretty secure, I would say. And no, that's not it. Maybe this way? No. No, that's not it either. Maybe here. No. Now, is there any way that this airplane is going to have its center of mass over this stand? No, there isn't. If you put this airplane on this stand, it's going to fall off immediately and you're going to risk damaging the thing. The stand that comes with this model, stock from Gemini Jets, unfortunately, is useless. And it doesn't really work with any 1/400s either, even though the hole is the same size as on most 1/400s. I wouldn't trust this to hold any of my model airplanes in any scale, and it's a real shame because being able to display your model in flight as one of your display modes is a really nice feature, and they tried to accommodate it with this one. However, as you just saw, it doesn't work at all. Nobody thought this through pretty clearly. Otherwise, you wouldn't have bothered to include that feature because it just doesn't work, and it's a great shame. However, what does work, if you're fortunate enough to have another 1/200 scale model of a similar size, is this Gemini Jets stand in 2 pieces that ships with a number of their 1/200 scale models. They also give you a retaining screw to put in the bottom. I'm not going to install that here just for the sake of brevity, but that would install through the base right there, through that little hole. This has absolutely no problem supporting the weight of our Janet 736. And of course, it fits perfectly into the provided hole in the belly of the aircraft. We'll get this into position. Don't want to rush that. And it even has a little velvet pad on the pylon, just so that you don't scratch the bottom of the airplane like so. Now, using improvised parts scavenged from another model, although it is a Gemini Jets model, we can now display the 736 in flight. You can see in the bottom there, we have got ourselves our blanking panels, which have remained in position through all of that finagling around, which I have to say, okay, good points, even though they don't entirely fit, I would say, in a manner that's flush or particularly authentic looking. They do fit, so that's okay. But yeah, this view brought to you by me just happening to have another 1/200 scale model of a similar enough size, but one that came with a much more high quality stand, so we can still get that in-flight display mode despite not being able to use the parts that were supplied with this particular model. Again, just as I said in my 1/200 review of Concorde, also by Gemini Jets, a much older model, they had a feature on there where you had opposable thrust reversers. It doesn't quite work because they keep falling off. This is a similar thing. That stand, albeit a good detail and a good feature to include, it just doesn't work. So maybe do some testing before you release these things to the public, guys, because if you're going to include a feature and then have it not really be feasible, it's probably best that you don't include it in the first place. But live and learn, I suppose. Again, just happened to be lucky enough to have another 1/200 of a similar enough size that had a much better stand, and that is the solution that I've arrived at for this particular model. However, with the airplane on the stand now, we're able to go freehand and take a little bit of a closer look at some of the details that we talked about previously. First of all, here around the nose of the airplane, you can see that we have got ourselves those wonderfully rendered cockpit windows with the tampo printing. Looks really good, I've got to say. And on this model, again, about the same size as a 1/400 scale 747. No mean feat to get details this small looking this good, yet Gemini definitely have delivered on that. We'll go underneath the nose and we'll take a look at that nose gear door that we've put in place there. You can see it's not quite sitting flush, but it is retained in position. There might be a little bit of magnetism going on between the door because it's metal and the magnet inside the airplane, but can't confirm that. Didn't feel any particular attraction between those two, but it is staying in place for what it's worth. But going above there with the cockpit windows visible, the little eyebrow windows that we talked about, very, very good. You can see the windscreen wiper detail. You can also see the shut line detail between the removable radome fairing and the fuselage proper. It looks very, very good. In addition to that, we've got our L1 door here on this side amidst the line, the only real feature in the livery in red. The window line looks very, very good, and very nice detailing along that L1 door as well with the hardware to open and close the door, as well as underneath you've got the shut line for the panel that would come out to extend and retract the air stairs. Looks very, very nice. More static boards along the port side of the fuselage. Looks very nice. There's our fleet number as well, 204. And then we get into our midships area and our wing spar, wing root area. There is the upper surface of the main wing with the overwing exit. Looks good. Arrow is telling everybody to walk toward the aft of the airplane and then slide down the presumably extended flap. Looks good. And then, of course, we've got ourselves our leading edge of the wing with the de-icing boot. We've got our strobe light here, green strobe on the port side of the aircraft. Looks good. And then we have our mounting pylon for the port engine, the engine nacelle, the de-ice ring around the intake side of the engine, and then the intake side of the engine proper. Looks very, very good. Some more detailing there on our ground start, ground handling equipment. Looks good. And then the hot side, the core of the engine with the tail cone. Looks great in there. Really, really cool. Here's the interface of this stand, cannibalized from another model, interfacing with the belly of the airplane. Looks good. No issues there, and it is quite secure as it is, even without the little retaining screw. Nice. Top side of the wing, as we saw, there you go. No step details in there for our flaps. And then the top sides of the canoes there, just covering up the flap actuation armature, which you can see underneath quite nicely. Cool. Continuing in the aft section of the fuselage, there's the L2 door, and then our empennage as well, with the tail number in between all of those. November 273, Romeo Hotel, rendered nicely and legibly, no problems. Empennage area with that big vertical stabilizer, as we remarked on prior. Looks good. No detailing on it, of course, apart from shut lines for the rudder and some hinge armature as well. Looks good. The horizontal stabilizer, similarly lacking detail in terms of livery, but you've got the de-icing boot along the leading edge, as well as the area of sweep where the trim could change the angle of attack of the whole horizontal stab in one go, should you want to do that to trim the airplane. Top side of the fuselage, you can see there is our little artificial ruby detail for our strobe light. We've got a couple other printed on details farther forward of that. We've got our separately applied antenna, another printed antenna, and then aft just forward of the vertical stabilizer, you have another separately applied antenna. Looks good. Right wing as well. Same sorts of detail as you would expect. Looks absolutely marvelous through there. No issues with anything that's being shown from this vantage point on 736 in Janet colors. Looks marvelous. Still freehand here from the starboard side of the airplane in flight configuration. Looks cool. Similarly to what we saw on the port side, we can see that wonderful cockpit window detailing there. Some more pitot tubes on this side as well, with that wonderful shut line nicely and crisply rendered between the radome and the fuselage proper. And then the window line, that red window line through the livery, looks really crisp and clean with no overpainting and smearing or smudging, so very cool. R1 door looks similarly good with the hardware detailed in there. I do wonder how they designed those tampo prints. Obviously they need to do that in multiple passes because they can only do one color per pass, but to get that lined up so well inside the door detail, which they must already have printed, looks really cool. Hats off to those guys for doing that. Additionally, though, on the starboard side, you can see the cargo hatches there, fore and aft. Very nicely detailed. Looks really cool, I've got to say. Nicely done. Very nicely done. Looks really convincing. If I had an actual background to put here, rather than just the blank white, you might think that you're looking at the real airplane taking off. If you could ignore the stand pylon, of course. Looks really cool. There is your starboard engine nacelle. Looking marvelous. Very nice. And the underside of the wing with your shut lines for the control surfaces visible there. And your canoes for the flap armature. Very nice. Tail cone from underneath looks good. Beautiful. November 273, Romeo Hotel. Looks good. Doors for the APU. Nice. Underside of the empennage there, horizontal stabilizer with the shut lines for the elevators. Then coming up, vertical stab. Beautiful. Really, really cool stuff to see right here. No complaints from me. And now, as far as we go in converting the airplane to its back on the ground configuration, you saw us convert it into in-flight. Getting it back into on the ground configuration, though, is actually a little bit more difficult than you might think. So, first of all, we will take it off of our cannibalized stand from another Gemini 200 model, and we'll just set that aside for the time being. And now we're left with our airplane back on the ground. And we will get you back on the ground so you can see this. Cool. Obviously, you've got your little bag full of your little spare parts. In this case, it's your landing gear. So we will open that up and get them out. Get them to clatter unceremoniously down onto the turntable. Fine. Next, obviously, we will lift the airplane up and we will start to undo everything that we did. We'll take out our nose gear blanking panel first. This one is semi-magnetic in terms of how it's secured, but nothing particularly aggressive, and you can see it comes out just fine. The main gear, the blanking panel's there with the little half wheel and tires on both of them. Sort of get a fingernail underneath each one, and you can see how they don't quite sit flush anyway, so they are already half out at the best of times. But I'm surprised they stayed in throughout this whole maneuvering and getting the thing onto the stand and all of that, so you know, fair dues where they are due, but still, you can now see that the trouble you get because they don't exactly stick in there flush, you might be better served to get one of the blanking panels that you have already removed and try to wedge it in to where you can find a little gap and try to get it out, though it's, as you can see, not particularly easy. Which leads me to make a recommendation to you here, that if you've got this model or any of the other Gemini 200 736s, you might be better off never doing this. In other words, don't display it in flight with the gear retracted, because as you can see, it's not particularly easy to do when you want to get it back to its on-the-ground gear down configuration. It's obviously possible, as I have done it before, but it's, as you can see, I've kind of got this port side landing gear blanking panel stuck in there, and that's going to require some improvisation yet again. Right, so coming back now with a very thin flathead screwdriver. Now, some of you are probably screaming at your screen right now, saying, well, why don't you use the little pick tool that Gemini give you with their 1-200s? Didn't come with this one. Probably should have. More than any other 1-200 I have encountered thus far, that pick tool would be doing wonders right about now. And you can see that even just with my fingernail, I have already done damage to this blanking panel because it's stuck in there. I am scuffing the paint off of that tire, which is really a shame because that should not be. However, it is unfortunately what is happening. And there we go. That is really bad. That is not a very user-friendly experience, I've got to say. And again, did it really have to be that way? There is that damage. I don't know if that's in focus or not, but there is that damage. That is permanent. Some black paint might be able to touch that up a little, but that is paint loss. Mostly that was because of my finger. The screwdriver didn't help, but my fingernail had already caused paint loss there, and that's just, quite frankly, unacceptable. However, be that as it may, we will put our blanking panels back in our little baggie, and I have the strong suspicion that they're going to remain there for the rest of their days, because that's terrible. Quite honestly, that's just not what I want to see. But now removing all of that obviously exposes our empty landing gear wells, which now shall be filled once again by our landing gear. As you can see, got our nose gear. Is that the right way around or not? It is. There we go. That fits a bit better. There we go. And now the mains. The mains are a little bit more interesting. The mains are not magnetic. Rather, they are compression fit or friction fit. And this area here on the main gear, it is compressible. There is a soft rubber around the side of the pylon there. I know it's hard to see because it's so small, but there's a soft rubber around the bulbous end here opposite where the wheel and tires are, and that compresses a little bit and it sits inside the well, which means that you've got to get it in there at a certain angle, just like you did with the blanking panels, and then everything should, caution should, be copacetic. So we will line everything up, and we will get everything inside. And just as before, they may or may not go in straight the first time. So there might be a little bit of adjustment that has to happen after you get them into position. But once you do get them into position, they generally will take up the weight of the airplane just fine. And there we go. You've got your 736 now on the ground once again. Its weight held by the landing gear, and everything looks just fine as it should. And generally speaking, this is the way this model, I believe, should be maintained forever and ever, simply because, well, you saw the trouble that you get with trying to remove those blanking panels when you want it in the in-flight gear retracted configuration. Bit of a shame, but that's it. I may well modify this model and permanently affix the extended landing gear in their positions with some super glue. Again, wish I didn't have to do that, but it looks to be the best situation here. And now with our landing gear back re-established in its proper positions, I figured, let's take a look at both of these models together. The 1400 obviously in the foreground, and the 1200 behind it. Really taking a look at them from, a fair distance, it's really cool to see just how faithful the detailing is on both of these models, despite the size difference. And remember, this 1400 here, it is pretty tiny. It's only about 3.5 inches long. So yeah, despite the small size, they managed to cram in some really great detail here on the 1400. And then when you take a look at the same area on the 1200, well, you see just how nicely they complement each other, and just how nicely a lot of that detail is carried over. Despite being twice the size here in the 1200, similar details are present on the 1400. Of course, some smaller things, physically smaller things, are omitted simply because, well, how small do you really reasonably expect Gemini Jets to be able to make something? But on the whole, really, I've got to say, it's pretty impressive to take a look at what Gemini Jets are able to do here in 1400 as well as 1200 scale. And when you've got the opportunity to have them side by side, and of course, there's your proof, the same aircraft here, the same tail numbers. November 273 Romeo Hotel there on the tail of the 1400, if it would focus. And then, of course, obviously, you have got the same tail number there on the 1200. So, 1-to-1, same airplane. Very, very cool to see that. Nice opportunity to be able to take a look at two models of the same airplane in two scales. And really, despite it being a really weird one in terms of Janet being one of those airlines that officially doesn't exist, it's cool to have these. And I'm glad that Gemini decided to make 1400 and 1200 versions of this, and it's a small enough aircraft to where I felt justified in being able to get both of them, one in each scale, because, well, it's a really unique piece, and I'm glad to have both of them. So there it was, in 1/200 scale, with a little cameo from its 1/400 scale little brother by Gemini Jets, the Boeing 737-600. It is a very good model, I must say. I think I've probably been a little bit harsher on this one than I have been in any of my other reviews of die-cast model aircraft thus far, and that's really coming out of frustration, I've got to say, at some rather small but arguably important details. Number one, that stand that they give you. It just doesn't work. It's useless for anything. I wouldn't even put a small 1/400 on that stand. It's not at all secure. It's difficult to assemble, and then it barely supports its own weight, let alone the weight of a 1/200 scale model aircraft. So if you do have another 1/200 that came with the single pylon stand with the stamped steel base, as you see it rotating before you here now, use that for this one. If not, buy that stand separately from Gemini Jets because they sell it on its own as well, if you do intend on displaying this aircraft in that in-flight configuration, either here as you see now with the landing gear extended or with the landing gear retracted with those blanking panels that we also had a little bit of trouble with. The airplane is very good. The model is very well executed. The detailing is very good. The construction is very robust, I've got to say. But those little detail executions could have been done a bit better. The stand, it's pretty obvious. I'm not going to continue going on about it. The blanking panels, though, when you remove the landing gear and you install those blanking panels to show the gear retracted, the nose is fine, no problem at all. The mains, though, as you saw, they went in well enough and they stayed in position as well. But when you go to take them out, it's pretty difficult to take them out, and sometimes you're even going to have to enlist the heavy artillery in terms of, yeah, here's a screwdriver and we're going to yank the thing out by getting underneath and prying something and hopefully not breaking something. Well, we didn't break anything, but we did scratch the paint off of one of those blanking panels a little bit. And I did that with my fingernail. That wasn't the screwdriver yet, so definitely a little bit to be desired there. And I feel justified in taking a little bit of a hit at this model in those departments because Gemini Jets know how to do that much better. Obviously, the stand that this is sitting on, Gemini Jets produced this stand. It came with another 1/200 scale aircraft that I have that's of a similar size to this one, a little bit bigger, but obviously it's sufficient. And Gemini Jets also know how to do those blanking panels better. At very least, the removal of those blanking panels, they know how to do that better because in other 1/200 scale model aircraft that I have that have removable landing gear, they give you that little plastic pick tool to stick underneath those panels so that you can pop them off without doing any damage or struggling untowardly. They didn't do either of that with this model, and it just feels a little bit cheap, quite honestly. I wish I didn't have to say that, and I'm actually quite surprised that I have to say that because I know Gemini Jets can and have done better. But on this particular one, for reasons unknown to me, they decided to cop out a little bit in those departments, and unfortunately, the user experience of dealing with this model does suffer a bit in proportion. Thankfully, though, the model itself is just as good as any other Gemini 200 series model that I have yet encountered, and because of that, it's still one of my favorites despite those rather sizable detractors. Again, I wouldn't say that those are detractors from the model for the sake of it being a model, but they are definitely detractors in terms of the usability and the user experience and the, I suppose, replayability of bringing this model out, putting it on display, putting it into different configurations for different phases of flight. I'm not going to do that very much with this one. Yes, I will take it out and examine it and put it on display from time to time, but the landing gear, as you see them affixed now, they are going to remain there forevermore. I'm never going to put that thing in the in-flight configuration ever again because it's just too difficult, and quite frankly, if I already took paint off of one of those panels just by trying to take it out, what else am I going to do to this airplane in time if something else happens where it's jammed and it needs to be rescued by an outside appendage once more? I don't know, and I don't particularly feel like taking that risk. Therefore, we will keep it here on final approach at best case here with the landing gear extended. Be that as it may, though, on the whole, this is a very nice model, and of course, whenever I've got the opportunity to have two models in two scales of the same aircraft, it's a very difficult opportunity to pass up. So for all of its faults, I do have to say, though, I do still like it very much. It is one of my favorites, and it is one that I'm quite happy to have in my collection. Until next time, though, I do thank you all very, very much for watching. F-Man saying thank you very much, and of course, we will see you soon.